Okay. Hi, Nick. Welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast. Yeah, absolutely. As we were just chatting about before, I came across your profile on X, the app formerly known as Twitter. And there were a bunch of things that you were talking about, posting about, sharing, commenting on that really stood out to me, given, the things that I've experienced in my own life and the things that are interesting to me. And the two of those things that really popped up was you talk a lot about the troubled teen industry, and then you also talk a lot about authoritarianism. And I'm really interested in your thoughts and also your experience in both of these, given both these topics. And I think obviously that there's a lot of overlap. But if it's okay with you, I think the best place to start might be to just, if you were willing to share your story, or like how these things came to be important to you. I'd be really interested to hear that, and then maybe we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of my journey, I really just experienced a lot of these dynamics myself. Um, and so a lot of the things that I'm describing, I had a pretty good awareness of them even when I was pretty young. But that perspective was really not very much tolerated. And um, so, I had a fair amount of conflict with my environment, but it certainly wasn't, it was somewhat contradictory, right? So there was some conflict, with kind of adults in my life, maybe with, my family of origin, with the school system, with the mental health system. But then there was also a lot of positive as well. I had a lot of passions. I had a fair amount of support in those passions. I was really interested in like making money in various ways. I had, some small businesses. I was interested in performing arts. And in general, I really liked doing things where I could kind of be introspective, where I could kind of explore like my own sort of emotional depths, having uh, you know, deep conversations with people, being able to be in nature, that kind of thing. So it's sort of that type of a kid. But but there was still a fair amount of conflict. And so I was really strong-willed. And so eventually, while kind of continuing to commit to my own perspective and not really willing to abandon my own sense of myself and my own sense of what was true, I eventually got sent to youth mental health treatment, so to speak, or the troubled teen industry. Um, and that happened when I was around, I just turned 16. And I think that it really just, at least what I experienced, really just amounted to psychological abuse and brainwashing. I've read a lot about this is a topic I'm really passionate about, is like basically brainwashing and coercive persuasion. And I've read a lot about that. And there's a great chapter in the book Brave New World Revisited by Aldous Huxley, where he talks about brainwashing. And it just like really perfectly captures a lot of the dynamics that happen at at these kind of mental health treatment programs where and I can get into this more in detail later, but so coming out of that, I was there for a couple of years, and then coming out of that, I basically tried to pretend like it never happened. I was very much in survival mode. I'd had a lot of trauma from that and a fair amount of trauma from my experience before. And so I was really just focused on surviving and kind of achieving in conventional terms. I was going to college and then went to graduate school and was kind of in a, fairly sort of societally oriented education and career path. But there was still this part of me that was still kind of interested in the stuff that I was always interested in like I'd had this latent perspective, like I was describing, that was just kind of totally coerced out of me. And I was, I'd kind of been reclaiming my interest in things like philosophy and self-awareness and Taoism and like Ralph Waldo Emerson. I was always really passionate about kind of human potential movement, people like that. And so, um, yeah, so eventually I figured out two main things, which was how to heal myself, how to kind of heal my trauma, and how to sort of reclaim more of myself. And I've really been on that path in a very focused way for a long time. And then also just kind of figuring out the truth of what happened to me. And a lot of that happened when I discovered a number of different thinkers that sort of seem to really capture the actual perspective and experience of young people that go through some of these kind of authoritarian things, because so much of it is, I think the default in our society is not their perspective. It's the perspective of the adults that have control over these kids. So we can get more into that, but that's just kind of my journey in a nutshell.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. I am curious to go a little bit into a little bit more detail on a couple of those items. But if it's helpful, I can just share perhaps a little bit about myself, my own experience, and then kind of come back to you, because as I was saying before, well, first of all, like I never went through any kind of troubled teen industry. I was never. I I was the kind of kid who I had all these curiosities. I was interested in a lot of things, but just the way that I grew up, I looking back on it now, it seems like it was such a bubble. Like I was encased in such a bubble that I wasn't getting a lot of influence from the outside, and so there weren't a lot of ideas that I could bounce around. It took a long time, a lot of like living an actual life experience for me to recognize kind of this system that I was a part of. And in a way, I needed that experience before I could have like an outside perspective. It's interesting because it sounds like you almost had some innate, I don't know, proclivity towards emotional curiosity, emotional intelligence, or at least knowing that you wanted to have some level of awareness and that you wanted to have some level of autonomy. But for me, to be honest, like I think I was, for me, it was like a religious setting. It was a family setting. And it was so, in a way, I was so isolated that I really didn't have an opportunity to, as a child, to really explore those kind of things. And so I think that I was, maybe for me, it was just like I had this strong desire for the story to be true, like for the narrative that we were all participating in to be true. And so it took a long time for that to kind of work its way out of me. But for yourself, what do you think it was for yourself that like gave you this insight into, like thinking differently than your environment, even though you had to kind of put that thinking on hold for a while? Was it just who you were? Was it genetic, or was there some kind of exterior influence that was allowing you to have these perspectives?
That's a really good question. It's hard for me to say. I think it was definitely innate for the most part, but I remember like encountering a few people when I was younger mostly adults who were very like-minded and who seemed to kind of nurture that a bit. And maybe that was enough to give me some confidence in that. But still, I mean, like you, a lot of these things were latent and not supported by my environment in a lot of ways and much of the time. And I think like that's a really important aspect to this is the importance of being supported in the environment in one way or another. So for example, like the reason why coming out of the troubled teen industry, why I was still so brainwashed for so long and didn't really have my real perspective was because I couldn't find it, right? It wasn't really in the culture. I didn't really see it anywhere. And then when I did see it, when I did, discover books and writings and things like that, it was like, wow, that's really powerful. So I can really understand what you're saying, how you were growing up and it wasn't really there for you yet.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you talk about books, or just coming across things that you're reading, there were like little moments throughout my life. And when I look back on it now, it was like my psyche was like holding on to all these little ideas that were going to become useful at some point. when I was willing to kind of like bring them all together and actually act on them. But yeah, it is interesting. There's this term, bibliotherapy, and it's basically just like the therapeutic effects of reading. And I think what I experienced when I was young was a version of bibliotherapy when there really was no other kind of therapeutic anything available, whether it came from like an emotional perspective or like psychology, intellect, even mysticism and kind of like true spirituality. I think I got most of that from reading in some way, and a lot of it probably was just fiction, stories that have stuck around forever, that may seem innocuous, especially in a group like that. Things like Peter Pan, stories like some Charles Dickens books like Great Expectations, things like that, where these little ideas, they stick with you, and in the context of the environment, you can't really figure out why they're important to you until later when you can add some more information to them, that kind of thing. For you in this experience and going through what you call the troubled teen industry, was there any religious aspect to it, or was it more of a secular situation?
No, it was secular. Yeah, there's a lot of diversity in that space, in the troubled teen industry space, or which is kind of synonymous with youth mental health treatment, or at least coextensive with it. Um, so I went to the programs I went to were sort of like the gold standard, supposedly, of them, which I think is pretty significant because it's pretty disturbing then to think about like what an average program or an above average program would be. But yeah, I went to ones that were more sort of catered to a kind of sort of pseudo progressive, like coastal milieu.
Yeah, absolutely. So then was the objective then I guess it was all about correcting behavior and probably preparing you for this world where you could actually be a productive member of whatever was considered, a productive member of society. Was that kind of the bent of it then?
Yes, I would say there was a lot of that. I mean, it wasn't necessarily explicitly that way because there was a lot of propaganda around, you know, helping you become your authentic self and figure out who you are and all of that. But I didn't really find that there was any of that. It was just much more about kind of, yeah, turning you into what your environment expects, into what your parents expect of you. If you have some kind of countercultural proclivities, like if you're interested in some things like that, they, would be inclined to basically brainwash you out of that, kind of convert you out of that. So that's a lot of what I experienced and saw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to get into this idea of brainwashing, but at the same time, I'm just to harp on this idea a little bit more from like a secular perspective, fitting into the world. Did this mostly mean like getting you on the path where you were going to go get an education, get a job, that kind of thing? Was it mostly like this interesting thing, this crossover between education and mental health and preparing for the future and growing up? In the Western world where we live today, it seems to be all about being able to fit into the economic system in a way.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that there was a lot of that was there implicitly, like it is in general, right? It's very much implicit. It's not usually, I mean, I guess sometimes it's explicit. There was a lot of pressure of like, you have to go to college, your parents expect you to go to college, you have to go. Um, I mean, personally, I actually quite liked college in a lot of ways. I really didn't like, and this is something I'm sure, we'd want to get more into, but I really didn't like school before college. I really hated high school. College I really liked. So it was kind of interesting how like I was sort of being pushed, kind of all of us were being pushed into that direction. Um, but yeah, I mean, because I think that like I think it doesn't necessarily come down to being able to like fit into the economic system because I think you can do all kinds of different things and fit into the economic system, right? I mean, there's people that do all kinds of interesting and creative things, and it's sort of on some level, it's kind of maybe scam is too strong of a word, but perhaps a little bit of a scam that like the only way you can fit into the system and survive in capitalism is going to college and, working at Morgan Stanley or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think that from some families' perspective, there's like this need to get the kid out of the house at 18. And so at the base, at the bare minimum, they need to provide for themselves. They need to be able to survive and provide for themselves. So, I mean, the world I came from, a lot of times that looked like college, the military, or some kind of trade. And so
Right.
you've got to be ready in that way. But I just imagine that there's a lot of that focus, a lot of this focus on, like you were saying, there was like some messaging around the authentic self. And for a lot of adults, like discovering the authentic self may very well just be how you make money. Like there's like this connection between like, this is who you are. And so this is what you do to make money. But I guess
Yeah.
behind that, there was kind of this, I imagine there's kind of this facade about the authentic self in that way. But you were saying you didn't really see things that were actually trying, because where you've come now and what you've experienced now, you probably have come a lot closer to figuring out what this authentic, true, like who this true Nick is. And at the time, I imagine that wasn't a big part of the curriculum or the system.
Yeah, because it was very much like outside in, right, versus inside out. And this is kind of what's confusing about it is that it's supposed to be, ostensibly it's this place where, oh, you figure out who you are and you develop self-awareness and all of that. But it was really not that. It was really reducing self-awareness, and it was really about controlling you from the outside in and really programming you in that way. So I think that's the key is that it's more of an outside in dynamic.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that ties into like the idea of authoritarianism and somebody else having an idea of what is best, what is proper, what you should be doing. A lot of like thou
exactly.
shalts, secular thou shalts, I guess.
Right. And
Um,
and from the perspective of like even just oh, what you're gonna do to make a living, where you're gonna go to college, what you're gonna do. I mean, all of that it comes from the outside in these kind of environments too. It's like, well, this is what you're gonna study now. This is what you're gonna do with your time. This is what your behavior is gonna look like. And if you don't do what I say, I'm gonna make you suffer. Um, And so, I mean, even if it were like, well, you need to be out of the house at 18, you need to figure out how you're going to make money, but we're going to help you do that in a way that seems to come kind of downstream from your authentic self, and we're going to help you figure that out. I mean, that would be maybe kind of positive, but that's not what happened.
so, do you mind sharing a little bit more about what actually did happen, or like what did the program look like, the curriculum? When you talk about brainwashing, like what does all this look like?
Yeah. So most kids, as I understand, go through these programs. They first go to like a wilderness therapy for like 8 weeks, and then they'll go to some kind of a longer program. So a lot of kids go to a so-called therapeutic boarding school, and I went to one of those as well. Um, yeah, in terms of what they look like, so there's um, there's a lot of punishment. So there's like many, many different kinds of punishment that are always being threatened. And so one of those punishments is social isolation. So if you are non-compliant or break the rules too much, or really just for whatever whim, they don't like your attitude, they don't like the look on your face, they can threaten social isolation. And so you can't like make eye contact with people for days or weeks or whatever it may be. And there's just many different kinds of punishment, like over a dozen probably. And then they invent more too. So like they can make up new kinds of punishment, like, oh, you can't read books, or you can't have like a pen and paper. Like they just create new ones. And so, in that sense, there's kind of a constant sense of threat. And that constant sense of threat also comes from the fact that there's regular, almost daily group therapy, or what they call group therapy, but it's really more like attack therapy. And I think it's actually quite similar in a lot of ways to the struggle sessions that occurred in Maoist China, and you'd see at like re-education camps in during the Korean War, where yeah, you're basically being like attacked, humiliated, that kind of thing, forced to share your thoughts. Um, so you really don't even have a right to your own thoughts. And I mean the lack of autonomy is really extreme. Like people complain about lack of autonomy in the public school system, and I agree with them. This is like a whole different thing. So I think, yeah, I mean, when you look at it that way, it's like it makes sense that a lot of these kids come out of there with a lot of trauma and really are just like shells of themselves. Um, and I'm trying to think other aspects of it, because there's all these different aspects of it that kind of come together into this one thing. These clinicians that are running the program basically have the parents kind of under their thumb because the parents are really freaked out, and they get the parents really freaked out. So they'll tell the parents, if you don't keep your kid here, if you don't really do exactly as we say, then your kid is going to be dead or in jail. Um, and so the amount of power that they figured out how to like have for themselves is pretty extreme. And so under that kind of stress, I think it's pretty easy to then sort of just turn these kids into whatever they say.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you bring up Maoist China because you're talking about your own personal experience with these in this industry, or these, I don't know what you would even call them, like camps or institutions or something. But then you bring up how it's very similar to Maoist China. I think the reason that it's so interesting to me, like your experience and the things you're talking about, is that I grew up in a religious setting where I was very indoctrinated. It was very authoritarian. And then again, going back to this idea of reading books and learning about the world, discovering through books, like I've read, you know, the Gulag Archipelago. You read something like that, and you see these patterns of, I guess, what you could call like authoritarian manipulation or authoritarian control, brainwashing, threat of punishment, those kind of things, where it doesn't. I often think about this because you even said that you get to the point where you don't even have your own thoughts, your own self. You have to question yourself. And anytime I see like an authoritarian system, it seems like somebody's at the top and they're telling a story, and that story comes with all of these threats of punishment. From a religious perspective, there were all these threats of how you might be punished in the real world for disobeying, say, like the commandments of God. But then there's also threat of punishment in the next life. And what ends up happening is that the way the human psyche works and the way that our group psyche works is the same, to the point where if you're not allowed to talk about things in public, very often those same people who aren't allowed to talk about things in public, they stop thinking about those things even inside their own heads, because they start policing themselves for safety reasons, right? They start policing themselves within their own head, and then it all becomes this like contorted system of control where it's not so difficult to see the connection between, say, Maoist China and some cult from Northern California.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything you said there, I just totally resonates. Yeah, I think the dynamics are really not that different. I mean, they might be really the exact same dynamics. I really encourage anybody to read that one chapter I described, brainwashing, in the book Brave New World Revisited. It's a nonfiction by Aldous Huxley, and it's really accessible, and it just like in a couple pages perfectly captures a lot of those dynamics that I think totally occurs, you know, can it shouldn't surprise us that an authoritarian in any setting would use those kind of tools for for indoctrinating people, for getting the authoritarian in the head of the individuals so that they can really just control them from the inside out. And it sounds like I think it sort of sounds extreme to people to like compare these things, but yeah, the more I've thought about it, the more I've learned about it, I don't think it's extreme at all. I think it's pretty clear. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's not as far as people who have been doing it over time. Well, there. Okay, so there's. I also believe that there's different types of people who enforce these authoritarian systems, and some of these people are probably very aware of what they're doing and very intent on controlling other people. And then there are other people, like I look at a lot of people in my life, again, going back to religion, there are a lot of people who are just trying to be the best person they can be. And this is the system that they're in. And so they think, they genuinely think that this is best. You know, there are probably a lot of parents out there who are scared and who do think, oh, this is best for my kids, whether it's sending them off to a camp or whether it's the way that they try to manage their behavior at home. It's a lot of it probably comes from what they think is love or caring. And they've just misidentified some kind of fear inside of themselves that's making them try to control somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when parents have that fear, which like so many do, right? So probably every parent has a tremendous amount of fear when it comes to their kids. I'm sure some more than others, but it's then really easy for these experts or even, charlatans, let's say, to come along and manipulate parents and exacerbate that fear. I remember at the program that I went to, they would have our parents read these books like Beautiful Boy was one of them, and Tweek. So books about these kids who are extremely addicted to meth and basically like, just like their lives are a complete wreck. And so they would kind of have our parents read these books and really get the parents scared and then have the parents, they were using these things to kind of turn the parents into assets for the program. And I think this gets to the importance of parents themselves doing their own work of getting to know themselves better, becoming more self-aware, becoming conscious of their fear, right? So that they're not controlled by it, conscious of all of the things that are coming up in their dynamics with their children, because then you can navigate these really complicated and difficult issues with your kids a lot better. And I think that there's a lot of people out there, these sort of, I call them child experts, and some are better than others. Some are more exploitive than others. Some are more well-meaning, but they can kind of get a foothold and manipulate parents into doing things into doing horrible things to their children when the parents are really not conscious of all of their fear and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would imagine that a lot of parents are, I mean, a lot of children are just being raised by the school system, being raised by church groups, being raised by, these institutions that the parents themselves may have been raised by. And now they're just, unless the parent has become really aware and has worked through a lot of their own, shadow trauma, their own healing, whatever it may be, they may be, again, completely unaware that these groups, these institutions are actually, not best for their children. They just assume that there's just so many people that just, they are completely bought into whatever world they're living in. And they can't see that it's been structured that way. And what's interesting to me about that is, and again, I apologize for constantly comparing this to religion, but I think it works off of similar mechanisms where whether it's a secular group or a religious group, there's like a story that everybody is supposed to agree upon. Yeah. And then once you agree upon the story, then you have to act in accord with the story. And what's interesting to me about that is that I genuinely believe that to become an adult, you have to get rid of all the stories. You have to grow up to the point where other people's stories aren't controlling your life, or you're actually not a fully functioning adult human. And so there's a lot of people that at least I think, these are my own opinions, I guess. I'm not like quoting anybody, but or like pulling. This is just from my own experience, I guess is what I'm saying. But you look around in the world and there are a lot of people who have physically matured, but are still completely bought into some kind of narrative. and so they don't need to do a lot of thinking. And the challenge, the real issue I have with that is that to be an adult is to let go of stories and to be able to exist in a world where paradoxes exist. And what stories do is they make everything black or white, and they remove paradox. And the whole point of that is to put people in a world where everything is defined. And so they don't have to worry about things. They don't have to question different aspects of reality. And there's some authority who just gets to tell them how they should be interpreting things or how they should be seeing things. And that's where it becomes, childlike, where you have this authority, this parent-like figure who's looking out for you. And so for me personally, I look at, there's this huge political polarization, like a very strong political polarization in our country. And on one side, you have this group of people we call the far right, conservatives. And typically anybody who finds themselves on the extreme right are going to be religious in some sense, where they believe that there's a God who's in charge of everything. And so you have this parent figure who's looking out for you, watching out for you, making sure that everything's okay. To the extreme left, you also have actually the same mentality where people are looking for somebody to be in charge, looking for somebody to be in control so that the world feels safe and that the world is how it's supposed to be. And for the people on the far left, that just seems to be government. And so in either case, there are these people who haven't fully emerged into, their adult state, where they're still looking for somebody to give them instruction, guidance, protection, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think it's actually, again, religion, Maoist China, our own personal experiences. It's the reason it's so difficult to navigate is because it seems to be a very human challenge.
Absolutely. I just have one really quick thought on that, which is, I've spent a lot of time in China, and I studied abroad there in college, and I studied Chinese politics a lot. And one thing that the Chinese government will do when sort of defending itself, when it comes to criticisms about human rights or democracy or authoritarianism, is they'll say like, well, the Chinese government is like is like a strict but loving parent. It's like a strict parent that really loves its children. So it's interesting how like it's just what you're describing, like the people are like children, and the government is like the strict parent, and how, that some people see that as a good thing.
Yeah.
I don't personally, but
Well, there's a part of me that would love to live in a world that actually was legitimately, like, we actually had a real parental figure watching out for us. I mean, when you, I don't know, to be an adult and to look out at the universe, to look out at society and go, oh, like you realize like, oh, like nobody's actually in charge of everything.
Mm.
This is just a world of competition and everybody's just competing. Yeah, it's scary. And so I totally understand the people who want some kind of protector, some kind of guide, somebody who's going to make sure that in the end, good things happen rather than bad things. So yeah, I can totally relate with that. Yeah. So let's get into then, I'd like to hear maybe the transition in your story, this process of like escaping that system. You get to college, you actually really enjoy college. You're probably discovering more about who you are, enjoying life more. But when did this focus, or like, when did this come up for you where you're now turning back and examining this, analyzing it, and trying to retell the story for yourself?
yeah. A little while later, it kind of happened in different stages. So the first stage was like I was kind of discovering, that I read this essay, Self-Reliance by Emerson, just had a huge impact on me, and got me starting to think that maybe I've sort of lost myself. Maybe I kind of like didn't figure out how to really develop my real self, and that really mattered to me. So that kind of started to get me on that path. And then a couple of years after that, I started to discover uh, thinkers who were actually kind of shining a light more directly and more specifically on these things, right? Because if you're a kid who's in like an authoritarian school system or uh, an authoritarian or dysfunctional family system or aspects of the mental health system that are authoritarian as well, there's nobody who really supports your own real experience. And the only real um, support you might get something that people are calling support, where people are kind of maybe affecting, like being caring or empathic, but really they're just kind of imposing a certain thing onto you. And so I discovered some thinkers that actually reflected more like my real experience going through all of those things. So a big one was Bruce Levine, who's a dissident psychologist, and he wrote this book, or excuse me, he wrote this essay, "Why Anti-Authoritarians Are Diagnosed Mentally Ill." And and so his general thesis is like these behavior problem kids, so-called behavior problem kids, are really just quote unquote anti-authoritarian, and they're just not so willing to like buy into the BS basically, and they more question things and all of that. And because of that, they're regarded as these brats, but really they're not inherently disrespectful. It's more like they're just going to be disrespectful when they feel disrespected. Maybe they'd be inclined toward that. So, discovering people like him, I'm trying to think who else. Dr. Gabor Mate was one, and he really got me starting to think like, okay, well, maybe this is, maybe I just have trauma here. Um, and I'll just like go on a quick kind of tangent with that, which is, um, like a big part of what happens to me and what I think happens to a lot of people that go through these things is that mental health professionals will basically interpret your trauma that you're developing as some inherent defect within you, as a way of kind of spinning things so that the truth of what's going on isn't clear, basically. So like, and I particularly experienced this at the troubled teen industry, right? Where like you're going through these kind of brainwashing things that like cause PTSD for like POWs who are adults. Certainly it's going to cause a lot of problems for teenagers, vulnerable teenagers. And so the clinicians there, as I experienced, would really just kind of interpret your trauma that they're causing as some inherent defect in you. So I was really brainwashed about a lot of that. And so I slowly started to discover, like, well, maybe that's just trauma. And then that opens the door to being able to actually heal it. Um, so yeah, so I just started to discover these thinkers and these ideas that really helped me to reclaim my own real perspective that I had to abandon.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In fact, like I think I experienced a very similar thing, and the, Gabor Mate is like, I watched his doc. Maybe it only came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but it was huge for me because it was like just like you're saying, there were voices that finally came along that instead of trying to like label me or diagnose me with some kind of problem or try to say that whatever was wrong was some kind of thing inherent to me. Same thing happened where like somebody finally came along and just said something that finally resonated where I went, oh, that's what happened. Like, oh, like it's such a, yeah, like for me personally, like I went through about 10 years of going to doctors to try to figure out why I felt the way that I felt. Both medical doctors doing like blood workups and physicals and sleep studies, and also going to like therapists and doing both individual therapy and couples therapy and just trying to figure out why the hell I felt the way I felt all the time. Because I had from all outward experiences, or all outward perspectives, I had this great life where I was married, I had an education, I had a good job, I had, decent material situation, I had kids, I had free time, I was exercising, I was healthy, I was eating well, and I just didn't feel good. Like physically, mentally, emotionally, I just could never feel good. And so I was like in this search. I was on this search for trying to figure out like what can I be diagnosed with so that And for me, it wasn't like some kind of, I wasn't trying to have this badge for my identity so that I could have some kind of thing in society that I could show and be like, see, this is who I am. It was much more practical. It was like, how do I solve this? Like, how do I get rid of this? How can I just feel good and be happy? And so I was genuinely looking for like the correct label, and I was like going through these different paths to try to figure out what it was. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes along and just tells you, no, it's not you. It's the world you're in. And then you go, oh, that makes so much more sense. And then the whole, the whole story starts to come together. And you can see like, oh, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of us. I mean, there are probably people out there definitely that have some kind of thing that they're born with, or, some kind of condition. But for the most part, most people who were just suffering from a malaise, who are just suffering from depression, anxiety, just unhappiness, uncertainty about why they're doing the things they're doing, who may suffer from like relational challenges and all of these things, addiction. A lot of it is not them inherently, but the world that we exist in, which doesn't seem to be the world we evolved to exist in.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and it's just cool how that opens the door to actually being able to do something about it little by little. And it's also, I mean, it's sort of more difficult because it's like, well, this isn't just something that you can fix overnight with a pill or with a procedure or something. It's something, it's like you have to actually commit to your own growth and your own healing as a person. And that's like, you know, will take many lifetimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting too, though, that some percentage of people, a large percentage of people in any situation, they just kind of go along with it. There's, they can, for whatever reason, they can just exist in that environment and personify that identity, whatever it is. But what I find interesting is that there are other people, like I see this in you, for example, where you've got this curiosity, you're intellectual, you're like intelligent, but then also there's got to be some, there's some sensitivity, some kind of, lately there's this idea of like highly sensitive people. And I think that that's actually been shown to be a biological phenomenon that it even occurs in all mammal species, where there's some percentage of the population that's just a little bit more sensitive. And, sometimes I wonder if that's where this resistance to authority comes from, is like, you're just, unlike everybody else, you actually genuinely are more sensitive to the environment. And then you have to, what are you going to do? You're just going to sit with it and let it kind of crush you? Or are you going to push back against that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I started this Facebook group, which I called Anti-Authoritarian Personal Development, because I was trying to kind of come up with like a name that could sort of, it's not a perfect name, but just come up with something that could capture some of these issues and like signal what this might be about. And I first promoted it on the highly sensitive person Facebook group, the HSP Facebook group, and it was interesting the response I got, because I got a lot of people that joined from posting that. I got a lot of people that were really enthusiastic about it, and then I also got other people who like didn't like it, right? They sort of think it's like an egoic reaction to things. And I can understand that on some level. It's like, well, are you bringing a lot of like versus kind of enemy consciousness to this? And so it was interesting how it was a little polarizing, but there's definitely like a resonance in that space. There is some kind of an overlap. And this is something that Bruce Levine, the dissident psychologist, talks about, where like, he's talking all about anti-authoritarians, but he also talks a lot about, there's these people who are like more sensitive. And so that's related to these people having these kind of sort of mental health issues, so to speak, of, maybe they're more depressed, they're more pained, right? They're more pained by the things that they're going through because they're more sensitive. If you're in like kind of a family system that's really unaware, the parents have trauma that they, refuse to be aware of. If you're in like, these school systems, some people that are more sensitive to it are going to be more pained by it, and therefore they're also going to be the people that are more likely to resist it and try to break out of it. So it definitely makes sense that there's that overlap.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting, if you think about it, it's really easy to get caught up in like, this is our world, this is our experience. And so to think about the human experience through all history and all time, probably what we're talking about now has been the experience of just countless people, especially I would say probably starting around the time that we switched to a more agricultural society with these large city states and nations. And the more people you try to get under the same umbrella, the more that there are going to be people who experience this kind of reaction to the trauma. And I don't know, I talk a lot about like myth and stories on this podcast. And so part of the way that I see it is like we live in the Western world where, and this is not to say that these kind of things aren't happening in the East, obviously, because, you know, you went to China and we know like just the systems in China, Russia, places like this, North Korea. But in the West, at least, we have this idea religiously that there's this one God. And it really pushed the idea that the ego should be center to the human experience, like the human psyche. But also what it did was it made sure that all the other gods didn't get to exist. So there's like one God and no other gods. The challenge with that is that our archaic psychology was developed around a pantheon in our own selves. Like all of these gods are aspects of us. And when one God comes along and suppresses all the other gods, all of those gods then just become mental illnesses within us because there's some part of us that's suppressed and unable to get out. And yeah, I don't know. I see it that way. And I don't know, just tying together history and culture and the story that kind of built the world that we live in. Yeah, but I do want to ask you about just authority in general. Like when you think about authority, there's got to be like positive authority as well as negative authority, right? And so how do you define authority, or like how do you think about authority in its pros and cons?
It's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure that I have like super well-defined views in that regard, but one distinction that I've heard, which I like, is like the difference between natural authority and institutional authority. And so institutional authority is like it sounds, right? It's like authority because, you know, it's within a power structure. And then natural authority exists. It's more consensual, right? It's because like um it's because like, you know, everybody, because people like it. And so they then want more of it. And and I've also heard the distinction that's basically talking about the same thing of like authority being positive versus authoritarian. Um, and that kind of that dichotomy is pretty useful. I mean, I can look at different things in my life through that lens, and I can like put things in each category. You know, I can think like, oh, you know, I knew this one therapist a couple of years ago. I really liked this person. I would put that in the authority category, right? Or the natural authority category. But then there were these other people who were like, well, you know, this is how you have to do things, and you know, they're kind of authoritarians. And um so yeah, I think it's good to definitely make a distinction between those things, but I don't know that I have super well defined views beyond that.
Okay. Yeah, I just asked because we live in a world where there are institutions, there are nations, there are groups. And so there's some need for somebody to have authority over something. You know, like I believe that the police are an important aspect of any functioning society. But then there's this balance between healthy authority and unhealthy authority.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you too about earlier, very, very early on, you talked about like healing trauma. And so, you know, you were in the system and then you started, and I don't mean to make this sound all linear, but just the pieces, maybe you were in the system and then you started to come to an awareness, but then this process of actually healing, overcoming what you went through, or said from like a Jungian psychology perspective, trying to integrate that experience so that it no longer haunts you or afflicts you. What did that look like, and what has been most beneficial for you?
Yeah, I think there was both the kind of the cognitive aspect of it, of like actually understanding and developing my own perspective of what actually happened. And then there was just the actual like healing of trauma in my body, basically. Um, and I think like both really go together. I don't know how well you can do one without the other, but maybe that's something that a actual trauma psychologist could answer. But um, it really was just about like reconnecting with my gut feelings, reconnecting with what was in my body, and being open to everything that might arise within myself. And one of the main messages that I learned in my childhood and certainly at the troubled teen industry was basically just like feeling is not an important thing, right? Like you don't, it's not about what you feel, right? It's about your behavior. It's about showing up in the world in the way that the people that have power over you expect. Um, and so I really wasn't even aware that like that an aspect of being healthy psychologically was actually just being aware of your feelings. Um, and a lot of kids come from families that, where the parents have a lot of trauma, they're very dissociated, and so they don't really learn that it's a really, really good idea to be aware of all those things and like take some time to kind of process them fully. So for me, it was really just about really committing to that, committing to processing everything. And there's all kinds of different resources out there for that. I mean, I've really enjoyed meditation and kind of somatic meditation and being in nature, things like that. I know that some people like psychedelics or like consciousness medicine, that can help kind of pull up things that are deep within themselves. But there's a lot of different resources for doing that. I personally like the ones that are free, like just meditation and journaling and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say that I came from a very similar situation where feelings or emotions, not only were they not understood, if they ever arose, they were usually considered a bad thing. And again, coming from a religious perspective or religious situation, the other thing that would occur was that the way that emotions were defined was that if something felt bad, then it was bad. It was like from the adversary, it was from Satan, it was from this dark place that was evil. And then anytime something felt good, emotionally, not physically, physical pleasure was a different kind of thing, but emotional, anything that felt good emotionally was something that came from God. And so your emotions become very contorted and very distorted, where you really get to a point where you don't want to be feeling negative things. And anytime you feel good things, it's supposed to like reinforce this story, this narrative. And so I went through something very similar where I had already started to put together the ideas in my head cognitively, this understanding you're talking about. But I had to also go learn that my emotions, first of all, that they were even a real thing, that they existed, but then also that they were neither good nor bad, and that they weren't external. They were all happening inside of me, and that I had to like learn to sit with them, listen to them, let them process through me. And yes, similar, just a lot of reading, a lot of listening to podcasts, a lot of going for long walks. I am curious to hear, you mentioned somatic meditation, and I've tried various forms of meditation, but when you say that, I'm curious what you mean, only because uh, I've had very good results by doing a form of meditation that it took me about 5 years of meditating to land upon. But I'm curious, when you say somatic meditation, do you mind just sharing or describing what that means to you?
Yeah, just kind of I know that there's like an actual formal like modality called somatic experiencing. I'm not too familiar with that, but for me, it's just, closing my eyes and just being aware of the sensations in my body. And as you kind of bring that consciousness to whatever sensations are there, it sort of changes and it shifts. And that's kind of a way to move the energy within oneself. That's what it is for me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I probably experienced something similar where when I first started meditating, it took me a while to discover this, but I was doing it in such a way that it was actually dissociative. And I think that that's pretty easy to fall into with meditation, where you almost start to see yourself as separate from all these experiences, and that you're just the observer. And I think that that's true in some senses. But it wasn't until I started to really just focus on the things I was actually experiencing in my body. And for example, if I had like a tightness in my stomach, then I would just sit there and I would feel it. I would just try so hard to feel that tightness. And it was something that in my past I would run from. I would like try to avoid. You release that tightness and you just sit with it. And then all of a sudden, all these other, like you're saying, it kind of moves around. It transitions. You start to feel all these different things. But it's,
Yeah.
I think maybe I'm just harping on this because there's like this real sense in our world today that we should be mind over matter. We should not, like you were saying earlier, not let your emotions manifest themselves or whatever. You're supposed to just suppress them. But for me, real progress was made when I could actually sit with them and feel them.
Yeah. Yeah. Me as well. Me as well. I mean, I think that's where the real power comes from, because it's like if you're just trying to have kind of control over them and are really rigid in that way, I think that's really when your emotions control you. When you think that you're in control of them, and it's just this very kind of rigid thing, like that's when you get controlled by them and you're just in denial of it. Whereas when you actually take time to know them and process them and become conscious of them, then it's like there's a higher sort of inner compass or something like that, that then is able to kind of run the show. And just one other thing I'll mention is, like, when I think that this was certainly my experience, and I've heard this a lot, is that when you go through really intense trauma or like really intense brainwashing, that kind of thing, like religious trauma, cult trauma, mental health industry abuse, that kind of thing, um, it's really complicated. Like what is going on inside of you can become incredibly complicated, and there's all these different like parts of yourself that are interacting. And so it isn't just a simple matter of, oh, I'm just going to meditate and like be aware of what's in my body. It's also about really being aware of all of these different parts, getting to understand them. And as you do that, and yeah, and as you do that, then they start to kind of diminish and heal, hopefully. And that's been my experience. But it can be kind of overwhelming and difficult at first, because it's like, oh, I'm going to deal with this, but then, oh no, now five other things are coming up and I'm overwhelmed. And I think that can be a challenging aspect of this, but just if you like have patience and sort of journal and get to know all of it, like it can get a lot easier.
Yeah, and the other thing that I've noticed, again, just this is just anecdotal, speaking from my own experience, but you can go through all of these modalities. You can meditate, you can journal, you can do psychedelics, you can go to therapy, you can do all of this. But in a real sense, all of these things are just education. It's just teaching you that you do have these experiences. It's teaching you that, what you experienced was real and it's something you have to overcome. But what I found is that that's really just the beginning of the actual healing process. And the true healing requires that you take that information, that new learning or understanding, and you have to actually go back to life, and you have to live your life, and you have to like find ways to integrate this new understanding into your life. So like what you're saying is, once you become aware of these emotions, in order to not allow them to control you, it's really easy to like not give into your emotional state when you're meditating in a quiet room by yourself. But once you discover that emotion, then you need to go into your real life and interact with people. You have to be in traffic. You have to be like at the grocery store. You have to be doing your job, whatever your work may be. and you have to find ways to actually change your interaction with the world because that's the actual growth stage where you're actually genuinely working to be a better person because of the things you've discovered.
Yeah, totally. It's like that's where the real work happens. It's like doing the meditation just on your own in the morning is great, but it's only a tool for actually doing that work that you're describing in your life. And I think that it's one thing that makes it a lot easier. And I think it's a really important aspect of this is like not being, yes, you want to be really, committed to this, the more the better, but like not being sort of hard on yourself when you are unconscious or whatever, or when you do fail, because that's like literally how it works. So, for example, like, I mean, this still happens to me is like something comes up, and I am reactive in the moment. Well, if like 5 minutes later, I'm aware, I'm just like, oh, I was totally reactive and unaware there. And this was just an old pattern that I don't like. But 5 minutes later I realize it. Well, that's progress, right? Like any amount of consciousness you can bring to it, right? And if you can stop yourself right in the moment and sort of discharge that energy, that's amazing. But if you don't do that, that doesn't mean that you're not making progress. So, like, I feel like any amount of awareness you can bring is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, that's great advice. Just any amount of awareness, and then even if it takes 5 minutes, even if it takes 5 hours or 5 days, let's say the interaction involved another person, at least at that point you can go back to them and say, oh, hey, I realize what happened. And that alone, like going back to apologize or point it out to somebody is such a powerful tool, because the next time it starts, you've already had this conversation with somebody about this experience. And I think that's just great advice. Like, not to get down on yourself, but to see this as like a process, and that at any point in the process, you can act in a conscious way. And every time you act in a conscious way, the next time that same kind of process kicks off, you're going to be that much farther ahead.
Right.
Yeah. Believe it or not, Nick, we're already over an hour of being on here talking. So it goes by really quickly. But before we get off, I'm just curious if there's anything specific that you want to share, or anything you would want to leave listeners with about the things that you write about, the things that you think about, maybe even a positive message about all of this.
Um, I guess I would just say, if you're looking for more resources on this, more like kind of thoughts related to this, I have a YouTube channel where I've been sharing ideas, where I've been sharing some of these ideas. Um, I can't think. I think we've covered it. I mean, there's so much more that I could talk about, but I don't know if I have a good thing to close out with.
Well, I agree. I think we've covered a lot of stuff, and I think it's important. I think it's just great that like you went through this experience and you were willing to actually process it and then turn around and share it with other people, because in a real sense, you're going to end up being that same person to others who helped you overcome, these challenges. You're that voice that when people come across it, they're going to go, oh, that's like finally somebody saying what I've been feeling and experiencing. And so just even from my own personal experience, like I appreciate you doing the work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. And thanks for coming on. And I guess you threw out your YouTube channel, but where, what is your website, and where can people find you online?
My website is let me just make sure. Can I just make sure I have the actual
Yeah.
but
Yeah, of course.
it's imaginalcell.com, I believe. Um I apologize here. I don't know
No,
this.
that's okay. And yeah, we'll go ahead and link it as well when we post the
Yeah.
episode, so people can just click on it.
Yeah, okay, yeah, do that. But it's Imaginal Cell, and you can check out and that's mostly just my bio and links to my Twitter and YouTube page. So
Okay, awesome. Well, once again, Nick, I appreciate you coming on and chatting with me. And I would look forward to doing this again sometime. Much appreciated.
yes, me too.
Okay, thank you. Bye.